Hi, folks. Lou here, and I'm going to talk about something that's perhaps more history than game, but certainly applies to games, is important for games. And that's the nature of what happens when an empire falls. There are certain empires in particular that I'm interested in that disappear with few traces left behind, such as the Mayans and the Hittites and even the Assyrians. In other words, there's no successor empire. Often the few traces left corresponds to never to arise again. And in some cases, it's corresponded to we never heard of it until recently. For example, the Hittite Empire was only discovered a century or two ago that it existed. The Incas and the Aztecs might also be put into this categorization, although the Aztecs certainly are remembered much more than the Incas. The Incas are up there sort of in a very remote place, and their empire disappeared, and there's been no empire there since, and we know of it mainly through the Spanish. Now, on the other hand, we have empires, for example, the Roman Empire, that persisted for a very long time after it officially fell. The West Roman Empire was succeeded by the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantines, but they called themselves the Romans, even though they spoke Greek. Kind of an interesting context there. We call them the Byzantine Empire, but that's a modern name and not a name that they use themselves. Even in the West, the Roman administration persisted long after the Roman political apparatus was gone. And the barbarians, quote unquote, who had taken over those places relied on that administration, and gradually it ground to a halt. But that depended on the situation where they were. For example, where the barbarians converted from Arian Christianity to Catholic Christianity, they were more likely to mesh with the post-Roman administration than in places where they continued to be Arians and consequently were regarded as heretics by the leftovers of the Romans. We can find other empires that had successors. For example, the Ottoman Empire is succeeded by the nation of Turkey, much smaller than the Ottoman Empire, but it's still there. The Achaemenid Persian Empire of Cyrus the Great was succeeded by Alexander very briefly, but then by Alexander's successor, Seleucid Empire, for quite a long time, many decades, if not centuries. And when it finally went down, you had the Parthian Empire, and then you had the Sassanid Empire, and then you had the Arab Empire, all occupying roughly that same area. Not as much to the west, but more to the east. And those had some characteristics common with the original empire of Cyrus the Great. And even much, much later, in say the 17th, 18th century, there was a Persian Empire. So it varies a great deal. If an empire falls, it may be that it will disappear like the Hittites or even the Assyrians, or it may be succeeded by another relatively soon. And we can think of China in that regard, where one dynasty is succeeded by another. It may take 100 years, it may take a short time, it may take a dynasty that comes from the outside, like the Yuan, the Mongols, but you get succeeding Chinese dynasties. China is a different sort of place than Europe because there are not the same physical barriers, and they're not the same language barriers. There are two languages in China, I understand, but they seem to get together, work together, Han and Mandarin. Whereas in Europe, you have bunches of different languages. You have lots of mountain barriers and river barriers and so on. And so it was very difficult to combine all of Europe into one empire. Charlemagne tried, and he succeeded in a sense that he had a much larger country than anybody else, but it was not real big time empire size, not compared to the Romans or the Persians and so on. So, in world building or anything else, you can consider whether empires stick around or whether they're hardly known. If you read much fantasy fiction, you've certainly run into that sort of thing. And even science fiction, you have the empire that existed that's now gone for many millennia, and people don't know much about it, or they might. Thanks for listening.